Okay, picture this. Imagine a modern political mystery where forces that champion liberal democracy, the folks advocating for the rule of law, human rights, and constitutional checks and balances, actually turn around and tacitly support an authoritarian military coup. Sounds completely backwards, right? I mean, no way that happens. Yet this exact dynamic played out in Thailand in 2006. Today, we're going to dive right into this explainer to figure out exactly why that happened by breaking down the incredibly complex, shifting architecture of state power.
To make sense of this shifting landscape, we're going to tackle the paradox step by step. 1. The ambivalent state. 2. The regime framers. 3. 4 decades of regimes. 4. Decisionist politics. And 5. The authoritarian paradox.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, the ambivalent state, where liberal and authoritarian ideas collide.
We're grounding our explainer today in a really fascinating academic paper from the Pacific Review by Michael K. Connors. This research impartially examines the structural forces that led up to the 2006 coup against the Thaksin Shinawatra regime. It's a great piece because it helps us map out a really complex political ecosystem that goes way beyond your typical good versus evil narrative.
So here's the thing. When you hear the word authoritarian, you probably immediately picture a military dictator in uniform, right? Well, Connors says we actually need to completely decouple authoritarianism from formal regime labels. He defines it by the actual exercise of power. It's an apparatus of arbitrary power that is totally unaccountable to democratic institutions or the rule of law. What you really should take away from this is that a formally democratic regime can actually wield highly authoritarian power, and honestly, vice versa.
Moving right along to Section 2, the regime framers. Essentially, who actually wields the power here?
In this ecosystem, there are basically 3 main heavyweights fighting for control, known as regime framers. First up, we have the statists. Their power base is the military, the bureaucracy, and the palace. They want a strong, centralized order and see themselves as the unaccountable guardians of the nation. Second, we have the liberals. They operate through parliament, NGOs, and independent agencies, and they're pushing for limited government and the rule of law. And finally, the pluto-populists. Backed by big capital and massive direct electoral mandates, they favor a super strong executive power to aggressively push through globalized capitalist development. Every single one of these factions is trying to embed its own very specific pattern of social and political order.
But you have to remember, this isn't a clean fight. It's a ruthless, highly fluid game of survival. Think of it like a high-stakes chessboard, but the pieces aren't rigidly walled off into teams. The fractions totally blur at the edges. You might actually find a status working in the media, or a liberal embedded deep inside a highly conservative ministry. It's an environment defined by tactical retreats, constantly shifting elite alliances, and each force ruthlessly using absolutely whatever state power they have against the others.
Okay, Section 3, 4 decades of regimes and the shifting balance of power.
If we look back from the late 70s onward, you really see the cyclical nature of Thai politics at a glance. We start off with a military-led system that slowly allowed some liberal elements to creep in during the 1980s. Then, rolling through the 1990s, we see the rise of this emergent liberal conservative regime, which peaked with the progressive 1997 People's Constitution. But then the 1997 economic crisis totally flipped the board, paving the way for the electoral Pluto-populist regime from 2001 to 2006. And hovering over this entire timeline intermittently are sudden, drastic resets, which we are going to get into in just a second.
Now, the early 2000s were totally dominated by Thaksin Shinawatra. And what makes this era so critical for our explainer today is how his regime managed to severely erode that liberal conservative settlement from the 90s. And the crazy part, he didn't do it by rolling tanks down the street. He did it by instrumentally politicizing the system from within. It was an inside job.
This just perfectly illustrates our earlier point about authoritarianism existing hiding right inside a democracy. It's kind of scary how fast it piled up. Thaksin's regime used its massive electoral mandate to systematically dismantle checks and balances. Suddenly, the Electoral Commission became partisan. The Human Rights Commission was completely sidelined. By 2005, an emergency decree basically allowed the Prime Minister to bypass the administrative court entirely. The era also saw some truly severe human rights abuses, like extrajudicial killings during the war on drugs. So, formally, a democracy, but the actual exercise of power was increasingly authoritarian. This dynamic absolutely terrified the liberal framers, leading them to frantically look for an emergency brake.
Which brings us to Section 4, Decisionist politics. Basically, what happens when normal rules just completely fail?
There's this chilling quote by political theorist Carl Schmitt highlighted in the source: "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." It perfectly captures the very essence of a decisionist regime. This whole concept operates on the premise that the existing constitutional order is completely broken, that a genuine state of emergency exists, and that normal laws absolutely must be overwritten by whoever has the raw power to enforce order.
I really want you to stop and ask yourself right now, in any political system, who actually gets to decide that the rules just don't apply anymore? And once you rip up the Constitution, what on earth replaces it?
Well, historically, there's actually a playbook for this during Thailand's intermittent decisionist phases, like the coups in 1991 or 2006. Step 1. A junta, usually backed by the statist forces we talked about earlier, declares that the political crisis is just irresolvable under current laws. Step 2. They forcefully suspend the Constitution. Step 3. They claim absolute sovereignty to hit the reset button on social order. And get this, a 1952 legal ruling actually set a precedent that a government established by a coup becomes legally legitimate once it's accepted by the people. So, they effectively embedded this decisionist escape hatch right into the legal DNA of the state.
Finally, Section 5, the authoritarian paradox. Let's answer the big question. Why did liberals actually support a coup?
The answer really comes down to pure pragmatic survival. Because no single regime framer, not the statists, not the liberals, not the Pluto-populists, can totally dominate the state, the players become highly adaptable. The bourgeoisie and middle class might act as contingent Democrats when the democratic system benefits them. But when they were faced with a Pluto-populist leader systematically dismantling liberal institutions from within, these exact same liberals morphed into contingent authoritarians. They calculated that allying with the statists to condone an unaccountable military coup in 2006 was simply their best tactical move to stem the threat. Basically, they preferred a temporary authoritarian reset over what they saw as a permanent authoritarian slide under a populist democracy.
At the end of the day, this is a game of absolute advantage. Even when power returns to the electoral or legal arenas, it remains a fierce battle, defined by highly personalized networks. Every single player operates with the cynical, underlying assumption that the rules of the game could just snap at any given moment, forcing everyone to prioritize their own political survival over institutional integrity.
So, I'll leave you with this to chew on. Think about what this means for the future of any nation's institutions. If survival in the political arena means you have to treat your constitution not as a solid, unshakable foundation, but merely as a temporary truce, just waiting to be broken by the next decisionist intervention, how can a stable democracy ever take root? It's a fascinating, if sobering, paradox to wrap up our explainer today.